Sosthenes, our brother. And we were taking into consideration last week the human author of this book, the Apostle Paul, and the amanuensis that he used in writing or penning the epistle, Sosthenes, who is described as our brother. And we were also looking at the canonicity and authenticity of this book, the fact that it is attested to by various secular writers, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria, notably. As a matter of fact, these last three quote a great many passages from the 1 Corinthian letter, the largest number being quoted by Tertullian. He quotes more than 400 passages in 1 Corinthians. And the internal evidence is definitely Pauline. We were taking into consideration some of the characteristics of Paul as a writer, the fact that he's very logical and very systematic in his approach to a doctrinal issue, and also that he goes into side ventures or side discussions of various words or ideas that interest him, but he invariably comes back to where he left off. Another characteristic being that he anticipates, before he ever gets to that discussion, a particular idea by inserting that idea somewhere in the preceding discussion. All right, let's look today at the subject, to whom the epistle was written. He says in the second verse of the first chapter, unto the church of God, which is at Corinth. And we'll be noticing the expression church of God more intently or specifically when we get into a study of the book chapter by chapter and verse by verse. But he's writing to the church at Corinth. And it's ever good to take into consideration the background to the city. This city was named Corinth from Corinthus, who, according to many authors, was the son of Jupiter. If the son of Jupiter, then of course he was the son of the greatest god that existed in Roman mythology. But other authors say that he was the son of Marathon, and others say he was the son of Pelops. So actually we don't know, according to Roman mythology, who was his father. But the majority, I think, say the son of Jupiter. The city had a circumference of 5 miles, and it was located in Achaia of Greece. It was situated on an isthmus that connected north and south Greece, and the narrowest point was 6 miles. It lay on a tableland 200 feet above the sea at the foot of Acrocorinthus, which was a huge hill about about half a mile high. The word Acrocorinthus, Corinthus, of course, is the name given to the city, the son, if we'll conclude, the son of Jupiter. But Acro means highest, so highest Corinthian, or the highest part of the city of Corinth. And this was a hill about a half mile high, 1,800 feet some say, and that wouldn't be quite a half mile high, of course, but a large hill that lay just back of the city. I guess you'd say more of a mountain than a hill, wouldn't you? There were 2 ports, and these 2 ports were 9 miles apart. On the east was Cenchreae. I was going to put an overlay on the overhead. This isn't the best, but it will at least give us the location of the city. Right down here, you can see very quickly its strategic position. There's 9 miles across here from the one seaport to the other seaport. And on the east, on the Aegean Sea, was the seaport Cenchreae, and on the west, which would be your Ionic, or the Adriatic Sea, was Latium. And small vessels in Paul's day were transported over the isthmus, this 9 miles, by a tramway with wooden rails called diaclus. Through the harbor of Corinth flowed the commerce of the world. Numerous names have been given to the city, emphasizing its importance and prominence. It was called the Eye of Greece, the capital and grace of Greece, the bridge of the sea. That's an obvious name, a bridge from one sea to the other. And the Palace of Neptune, and the Acropolis of Greece by Strabo. He's a very well-known historian. Acropolis, again that word, akro, which is highest, and polis, which is city, so highest city of Greece. It appealed to luxurious living, and it earned its name the Lounge of Greece. It was the playground of ancient Greece. In 146 B.C., the Roman general Lucius Mummius crushed all aspirations the Greeks had toward independence by complete destruction of Corinth, and he destroyed the city by fire. And for almost 100 years, the name of Corinth all but vanished from history. But a new city was built in 46 B.C. by Julius Caesar, and he made it a Roman colony. And it became, as it was before, one of the richest, most powerful cities in the world. A Roman colony meant a minor Rome, and actually the citizenry of that city enjoyed the privileges that a Roman citizen enjoyed. So it was a wonderful thing in that day and time. In Paul's day, the city numbered about 600,000 souls, and it was surpassed only by Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. However, the majority of the inhabitants were slaves. The famous temple of Aphrodite, corresponding to Pandemonium, Venus of the Romans, was located on the Acrocorinthus, this tabletop of about 200 feet at the hill, on the hill actually, at the back of the city. Ancient cities were usually devoted to some particular god or goddess, being under his or her particular care. Diana was the goddess at Ephesus, and Minerva was the goddess at Athens, for example. We have a good modern counterpart to that. In Italy, for example, you have the patron saint idea, and I'm sure that it's been borrowed, as many other things have been borrowed, from paganism. The patron saint takes care of the people during that particular week and or that particular day, and that day or that week is devoted to that saint, some departed faithful Catholic who has provided a miracle after his departure. That used to be the requirements for sainthood. The individual lived an exemplary Catholic life and then died, and then after his death or her death, then a miracle was performed by that individual, and then the individual would be venerated as a saint. Well, I remember one time while we were in Italy, and they were trying to kill us at Castel Gandolfo. It wasn't Castel Gandolfo. It was they tried to kill us at Castel Gandolfo also, but this was at I can't recall the name now. It's been a number of years. But anyway, the hierarchy or the Catholic action told the people that if they'd kill us, they'd get the blessings of the patron saint for that week, which was Saint Antonio. And that made an impression on me in the name of religion, and by a saint, of course, they would receive blessings if they put us to death. And it didn't work, of course. I'm still here, but some of the members of the church in that city, Monte Compatri. Some of the members of the church were dragged out of their homes and beaten on the streets and a few other things like that. But and a child had his hand blown off from one of the bombs that they had prepared for our Jeep, and butcher knives were passed out to various ones. But that was the patron saint at that time of that particular city, and they were received his blessings had they done away with us. But that was true in ancient Rome, ancient Greece. They were devoted to certain gods or goddesses, and they were under the particular protection of that god or that goddess. The temple at Corinth employed 1,000 priestesses. Hieroduloi, which means sacred slave, who ministered to the baser passions and wants of their worshipers. In other words, in their worship, they engaged in sexual acts. That was their worship to their goddess. She was the goddess of sexual love. It's kind of amusing, and yet it's disturbing that in our modern times we have given some adoration to Aphrodite in our commercials on TV, and I am seeing those commercials have wondered how many Americans had any concept of what Aphrodite represented. It was the basis form of worship in which man could engage in immorality, sexual acts in the name of religion. Of course, we've got some of that going on in our own country today. We've got a church that's devoted to the devil, the Church of the Devil out in California. And reportedly, that's what they do in their worship services. They engage in sexual relationships. Well, Corinth had 1,000 priestesses. They called them sacred slaves, who ministered to the ones who came to that particular temple to worship. In other words, they provided for them sexual enjoyment in their worship to this goddess of sex love. That corresponds to the Baal and Ashtoreth worship of the Old Testament. The children of Israel were continually beset by Baal worshipers and Ashtoreth worshipers, and they were constantly going into apostasy in the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth. Baal was the masculine sex god. Ashtoreth was the feminine sex goddess, and they were not married, but we'll say married, and their children became the Baalim and the Ashtaroth. The Baalim were the masculine, and sometimes the word Baalim is used generically for all the children, just like man or children would be used generically. Baalim was sometimes used generically for all of them, but when used specifically, the Baalim were the masculine children born to Baal and Ashtoreth, and the Ashtaroth was the plural, the female children born to this relationship. And the ancient world was caught up in this Baal and Ashtaroth worship, and the children of Israel oftentimes went into apostasy in that way also. We see a good expression of that, I think, even in our world today. If you travel to Pompeii, and I mentioned that, and I think Judy had said that she'd been there with Doug. Pompeii is, well, it was during the time of Roman glory, one of the playgrounds of the elite of Rome. And the city was completely devoted to sex. A whole city devoted to it. Now, Mount Vesuvius erupted and destroyed the city, I believe, on 2 different occasions, and the city was rebuilt, and then the last time the city was destroyed, it was never rebuilt again. But in some of their museums, you'll find the man and woman engaged in the sex act at the time of the eruption of the city, and their bodies, well, actually what happened, covered by the ash and the lava, they filled the cavities there with plaster of Paris, and then took out that, and that's what it is. It's not actually the body, but it is the cast that was made from where the bodies lay, and they're engaged in the sex act. And that seems somewhat startling to Americans especially that go there and visit and might be led to that part of the museum and see that. You mean here they're about to die and they're doing something like that, you'd think they'd run for their life. Well, it's a form of worship, calling upon their goddess or God to deliver them, to protect them from what was happening. And that seems completely counter to our way of thinking, but it was the way that they thought and the way that they acted. Pompeii has been cleaned up, quote unquote, cleaned up considerably in recent years for visitors. And that's good, and yet it's a shame in another way. It's good in one way that it's cleaned up, but it's possibly a shame in that people do not really see historically what took place, what Pompeii actually was. Had been transferred to Naples, yes, a lot of it has been. Yeah. And they've cleaned up the city. If you'll pardon, all the signs, for example, on the city streets and the signs on the walls of the buildings have been either taken down or covered over, or you're led in a bypass of all that. And if you do go by it, the guard directs the attention away from it. But all the signs, and they're on all the streets and all the buildings, etc., are the male privates directing the way that the individual should go. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes, yeah. It's hard for Americans. You know, we think we live in a very degenerate and immoral society. We do. But we have never seen the depths of immorality, the degradation in society that existed in the ancient world. Well, nothing to compare. Oh, that's your archaeologists. Yeah, what they do, I'm not all that conversant with it, but they go in, here's ash from the lava, and generally it's the ash rather than lava itself, but the ash, it covers, maybe there'll be 6 foot of ash. They know through their excavation that there were bodies down there, and they come to a particular area where there were bodies. Well, those bodies have decayed and have gone away. But well, not the skeletons, but the imprint that the body left is still there. And what they do, they put holes at various parts through the egg, and they put the plaster of Paris down there, and then they get what existed. What they do with the children? Well, what do you mean, what did they do with them?
The children in the town?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Matter of fact, as you read in ancient history in regard to Pompeii, it had the highest venereal disease of any area in the world. I don't want to describe everything that's there, but you ought to go to Pompeii sometime if you can, and just ask for the true tour and get it will open up your eyes to what existed in the Old Testament in the Baal Ashtoreth worship into which the children of Israel constantly went in their apostasy, and also open your eye to what existed in Paul's day and time in the various cities into which he went with the gospel of Christ. We think we've got problems today in trying to reach our world with the gospel of the Son of God. We've never seen anything to equal what existed in that day and time. And that doesn't mean any condoning of what exists today, not at all. But we have never seen the depravity of man that existed back in that day and time. Maybe one reason that the gospel had such an effect upon the people. They thronged to the gospel of Christ because they were disgusted with what they had been acquainted with and living in for so many years. Well, yeah, I guess in many respects. That's right. The early church had problems. I mean, they had problems not only in persecution at the hands of the Roman government and at the hands of the Jews, but they had problems in the world in which they lived. It was just a very wicked place. And I guess Pompeii comes to mind because it is possibly a historically preserved site that gives us as good an insight as to what existed in that day and time as any place that I know about in the world. All right, here's a city that's totally devoted to the goddess Aphrodite, goddess of sex, sexual love. The temple in that city had 1,000. Now here's a city of 600,000 people, and the majority of those people are slaves. And so it wouldn't apply to them. Let's say 400,000 of the city are slaves. That leaves 200,000 people, and you have 1,000 women in this one temple minister to their baser passions, and that in worship to their goddess. Corinth's name was so closely linked to immorality that to Corinthianize was synonymous to leading an immoral life. The term was used for a great many years as a synonym for immorality, immoral expressions. We don't use it today. Now, some names have stayed with us. For example, sodomy, from Sodom. There's a name that has been preserved in infamy, I guess, through the centuries. But to Corinthianize is a name that has passed from our vocabulary. But it was a term that was used for a great many years, synonymous for immorality. And there are numerous expressions of that in the Corinthian letter. Look at the 5th chapter, for example, in verse 10. Yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must ye needs go out of the world. Now that starts taking on a different meaning and greater light of understanding when you consider it in light of the background in which Paul was writing, or the city to whom Paul was writing. He's writing to the church, but he's writing to the church at Corinth. He says, I wrote to you in an epistle not to company with fornicators. Yet not altogether with fornicators of this world. Well, they'd have to leave Corinth. But that's all Corinth was. Don't have company with fornicators? Well, you'd have to get out of the city, because the whole city's devoted to that. Or with covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters. Well, the whole city was caught up in idolatry. He says, for then ye must needs go out of the world. But now I have written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or idolater, or railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner, with such a one know not to eat. And in 6th chapter, in verses 9 through 20, won't take the time to read it right now because we'll be studying that, but he's talking about the immorality with which these people were plagued. The 10th chapter, and verses 7 and 8, he says, neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 20,000, and so forth. In the 11th chapter, in verse 21, he says, for an eating, no. I've got the wrong. It's wrong passage somewhere. I'll have to look it up. Either typed incorrectly or I wrote it incorrectly, something. Well, The 2 Corinthian letter does exactly the same thing. I probably had reference to the 21st verse of the 10th chapter instead of the 11th chapter. He says, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the tables of devils. And he's talking about eating the meats that's offered and sacrificed to idols and being a partaker of that. Well, it involved a little more than just eating meat, did it not? Because it's connected with sensual or sexual practices. And these Christians to whom Paul wrote were plagued with immorality. Why? They were eating here at the temple of their idols, meat sacrificed to idols, and a part of that would be immoral practices. And it was making its inroads into the church. All right, it's here that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. In studying hermeneutics, the rules for Bible study, we've often asked, well, from where was the epistle written? Well, here's a good illustration of the application of that law, taking into consideration where the author was at the time that he wrote the epistle. Well, Paul, in writing the Roman epistle, was at Corinth. And what he describes in the first chapter of the Roman letter is what he was seeing then in Corinth, which was typical of the Roman world. And he's writing to the church in Rome. And let's just notice, beginning with verse 21 of the first chapter of the Roman epistle, just read on down through the end of the chapter. You know, there's a great similarity between ancient Rome in the height of her glory, and what we're witnessing today in the United States of America. Great similarity between the two countries. Rome started as a republic. We started as a republic. And Rome went from a republic into a democracy, and we went into a democracy, and then from a democracy they went into a dictatorship or emperorship. We haven't gone to that, and probably will not go to that. But all the other things in connection with the collapse of Rome are being witnessed in our own land. She was a very prosperous nation. She was a very strong nation militarily and in her influence upon the rest of the world. Of course, she conquered the world and controlled the world. But she began to degenerate and dissipated into a lesser power, and the things that brought about her degradation are being witnessed in our own land. The immorality of homosexuality took over Rome, and it's taking over our country. And taxation, heavy taxation. Gibbons has, and I think we have it in the library, either 3 or 4 volumes. You remember, Marion? 3 or 4 volumes, depending on the issue. I think in our library it's 3 volumes. But The Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbons, which is one of the most historically accurate presentations of the Roman Empire and her dissolve that's recorded. And the things that brought about the downfall of Rome are seen being witnessed in our own nation. Heavy taxation, the love of pleasure, and becoming more and more brutal as a people. Television can't make it brutal enough anymore. Nothing shocks the American public anymore. They don't know what to do to shock them. They're running out of ways to shock the American public. We've become insensible as a people, and the taxation is running rampant, and immorality is being extolled, and homosexuality is becoming the in vogue thing, and just traces the history of Rome completely. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own heart, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. One of the greatest problems in our nation today are women who are becoming more and more lesbians, and it has become a very great problem in especially the business world. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, not in order actually, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit some things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. The latter part worries me considerably, as far as and I think many members of the church are concerned. We may not do them, but we have pleasure in them that do them. We turn on the TV, and the shows that are number one on the hit parade are those shows that extol everything that is here condemned. And they put it in a comic vein. It becomes an acceptable thing. We laugh at it. We enjoy it. We relish it. We seek after it. We may not do it ourselves, but we have pleasure in them that do it. And that latter part frightens me a great deal as a member of the church and in regard to the church as a whole. Gives us a very good insight, I think, into what existed at Corinth, not only Corinth, but in the Roman world. Now, not only were they devoted to immoral practices in their idol worship of the goddess Aphrodite, but her citizens were proud of their mental acuteness and physical abilities. They were interested in the arts, philosophy, and athletics. Again, we can see a parallel to our own nation today. We have become so wise in our conceits that we've become unwise, and that's what Paul said in Romans 1. We've given God over through our human wisdom and our love of human wisdom. We think we've arrived as far as knowledge is concerned today. I'm talking about not we in the church, I'm talking about our nation as a whole. Not only that, more and more emphasis is given to physical sports. It's frightening to see the money that's spent every year in the area of recreation and sports, and that runs parallel to what was seen in the ancient world of Greece and Rome. And Paul deals with that in the Corinthian letter, in the well, I have listed here the Corinthian columns. That's in the area of art. The Corinthian, the Grecian philosophers are still, well, their names are synonymous with wisdom today, like Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. The Isthmian Games have given rise to our own Olympic Games. In fact, we borrowed just about everything that we possibly could from those Isthmian Games that were at Corinth. And Paul alludes to that in the 9th chapter in verse 24, 26, and 27, when he says, I am living the Christian life, and not like some who run, receiving no prize, or like a fighter who beats the air and has no true opponent, things like unto that. In their conceit, they criticized all men and all things, and they questioned anything and everything. And Paul deals with that in the first 2 chapters. He talks about the wisdom of this world that comes to naught, versus the wisdom of God, and said that man in his wisdom looks upon God's wisdom as foolishness. Well, we're seeing that today all about us. Well, where a person puts his emphasis, he will generally excel for a while. A man who puts all of his emphasis on making money will generally make money, one way or another, if that's where all of his interests lie. The individual that's interested in developing a beautiful body will develop a beautiful body by some standards. The reason I put that, I frankly don't care too much for these overdeveloped, muscle-bound, superhuman bodies that we see. I don't think personally that that's the beautiful male body. I think there are others that are far more expressive of male beauty. But anyway, they put all their emphasis in it. All they do is stand before a mirror and work their muscles and keep training various parts of the body until they develop it to what it's supposed to be. Well, he'll do that. But once, it's true physically, it's true spiritually, it's true in every arena of life. Once they let down, if that's the emphasis, once they let down, it goes completely to pot. It just degenerates. It tears to pieces. And that's true in every arena of life. It lasts for a while, but then the way of the world, the course of this world, is degeneracy. And the only thing that lasts is that inner beauty and that devotion to God that brings more than this life has to offer. It brings an afterlife. And throughout the New Testament, well, Old Testament as well, it says put your interest in the right place. Give emphasis to the right thing. But they were Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, and these men were very wise men. They had a line of reasoning and wisdom connected to their way of life that has seen very little challenge down through the ages. They were very wise men, but it was worldly wisdom. Many of the ways of investigation or principles of truth that we rely upon today were founded by these men of ancient Greece. But in their wisdom, they forsook God, and they became so wise that they counted the wisdom of God as foolishness. And it was in that their destruction was seen. Now, background to the church. The church was founded by Paul on his second missionary journey, recorded in Acts 18th chapter, verses 1 through 7. And in this Corinthian letter, the 3rd chapter, Paul talks about his working in the city and the fact that he had laid the foundation, and then Apollos had come after him and had borne fruit on the foundation that he had laid. Notice the 10th verse of the 3rd chapter. He says, according to the grace of God which is given unto me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereon. I've laid the correct foundation, he said, there in Corinth. I preach Christ and him crucified. I preach the wisdom of God in Christ. I preach the gospel of Christ. You were established on that correct foundation as any other congregation throughout the world. But he says you're starting to leave that foundation. That's why you're receiving so many problems in the church there at Corinth. Let every man take heed how he builds upon the foundation that's been laid. In 52 A.D., Paul came to Corinth from Athens, and he joined himself to Aquila and Priscilla, or Aquila and Priscilla, as other Bibles will render it. Can't be dogmatic about how to pronounce pronounce names, but because you'll find different pronunciations given in different Bibles. But in 52 A.D., Paul joined himself to these two individuals. One reason that he joined himself to them, especially, they were of the same trade. Aquila was of the same trade as Paul, that of tent making. That would be like a home builder today. We sometimes, I think, fail to get the parallels. That would be like somebody build homes today. And they were of the same trade, so Paul joined himself to them. They were Jews who had been expelled from Rome by the 52 A.D. edict of Emperor Claudius, who was against Jews residing in the city of Rome. He expelled them from the city. And so they were expelled, along with others, went to Corinth. And Acts 18, verses 2 and 3 specifically will give that information. Paul remained in this city a year and a half. Do you know the average preacher stays at a congregation about a year and a half? What? They're following Paul's example. But that is true. Huh? I sure have. I'm a patriarch. I think I'm the oldest preacher, meaning having stayed in one location in the South Florida area. That may be at one congregation. There have been divisions, and some have stayed at other places, but I think I'm the patriarch of the area. In the spring of 54 A.D., Paul departed for Ephesus, and after a brief stay went on to Jerusalem. From Jerusalem he went to Antioch in Syria, where his third missionary journey began in 54 A.D. In the same year he again went to Ephesus, where he remained till the Pentecost 57 A.D. While in Ephesus he penned the letter to the Corinthians. And we can get that parallel by 1 Corinthians 16:8 with Acts 19. But the letter, as you'll notice on your outline, was not only addressed to the Corinthians, but he says, with all who in every place call upon the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, both theirs and ours. And we'll see throughout the epistle that Paul says, what I write to you, I write to all churches everywhere. What I write to you, I write to every saint everywhere. And so even though it's a letter written specifically to the church at Corinth, it is for every Christian in every age, in every place. It's for you and me. The date, the time of writing, was written just before Pentecost, as we see from 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 8, possibly written at the time of the Passover. How many days between the Passover and Pentecost? How many? 5? Huh? 5 times 10. All right, 50. You counted 7 Sabbath days from the Passover. That would be 7 Saturdays, or 7 times 7. And the next day was invariably the Pentecost, and it invariably fell upon the first day of the week. 50 days later. Written during Paul's third missionary tour, about 57 A.D. Place, from where it was written, well, we've already noticed from Ephesus. Again, 1 Corinthians 16, verses 8 and 9. Now let's look at the purpose and scope of the writing. In this epistle, Paul affirms and maintains his apostolic authority. There were a great many who challenged Paul being an apostle of Jesus Christ. Well, he wasn't one of the original 12 selected by the Lord. He wasn't one who took the place of an apostle. Matthias was that one selected to take Judas' place. So Paul was separate from the rest of the apostles, and that brought challenges from members of the church. And Paul was constantly having to affirm his right to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. And you'll see such affirmations in this epistle. He begins the epistle, as a matter of fact, in the first verse of the first chapter. Paul called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. I have a calling from God to be an apostle. In the 4th through the 7th verse, he said, I thank my God always on your behalf for the grace of God which is given you by Jesus Christ, that in everything you are enriched by him in all utterance and in all knowledge, even as the testimony of Christ was confirmed in you, so that you come behind in no gift, waiting for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, my work as an apostle was confirmed in you by the gifts that you have. Well, you couldn't have gotten those gifts except by an apostle, is what he's saying. In the 2nd chapter, in verse 4, and my speech and my preaching was not with the enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. And he goes into a discussion in the 2nd chapter of he speaking by the Spirit of the Lord, that which was given to an apostle of Jesus Christ. In the 13th verse, for example, he says, which things also we speak, not in the words which man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Holy Ghost teacheth, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. The 16th verse, for who hath known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ. How do we have the mind of Christ? By the Holy Spirit that's been given to us as apostles of Christ. And Paul includes himself in that number. He said, I've got it. And then, in the 4th chapter, in verse 9, for I think that God hath set forth us, the apostles, last, as it were appointed to death, for we are made a spectacle unto the world, to angels and to men. So, he again includes himself as an apostle. 9th chapter, verses 1 through 5. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? Now, you've been confirmed by spiritual gifts. The only basis for that is I'm an apostle. If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. My answer to them that do examine me is this: have we not power to eat and to drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as the other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas, and so forth? 15. Then of all the apostles, talking about the resurrection of Christ, and last of all, he was seen of me also as of one born out of due time. For I am the least of the apostles, that I'm not meet to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But he said, I am an apostle because I've seen the Lord. And I was born out of due time by the Lord for this purpose. Now, whereas he calls himself least of the apostles, in this particular passage, he said he was not a whit behind the chiefest of the apostles in the Galatian letter. It depended on what approach Paul was taking at that particular time as to how he applied himself in regard to the other apostles. And then in the 16th chapter, in verse 1, he says, now concerning the collection of the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Well, he exercised his apostolic authority and maintained his apostleship to Jesus Christ throughout the entire epistle. But more, he corrects the disorders that existed in the church of Corinth, answers some of the questions that they had. Some of the sins with which Paul concerned himself in the epistle were division, tolerating known public sins in their rank, not withdrawing fellowship, as we would speak of it today. I was a little not amused, that's a bad word. I was amused. Sunday before last, we had some names put before the congregation again in a withdrawal procedure. And it's a shame that we always have to apprise the congregation in a public way while others who are not members of the church and then others who are members of churches elsewhere are present. But you have to do things like that in keeping with the teaching of the Lord. But we had some members here from other congregations who challenged what was done. And we always have that. and they were challenging it before some of the members here, and said, I don't think that's right. And I was real thankful for this particular member. She said, well, you better read your Bible and see what the Lord teaches in the matter, and you'll find that it is right. Well, we don't do it at home. She said, well, maybe you ought to start doing it. And I thought, well, thanks be to God, you know. And that's right. They don't do it at home, possibly, because, well, we have a book that says the most neglected commandment, I believe it is. It may have another name, but that's the idea. The most neglected commandment in the church. We would not think, for example, of missing the Lord's Supper or preaching that we must attend services on the first day of the week, partake of the Lord's Supper. We have to do that to be the church of our Lord. But then we'll let another commandment, like withdrawing fellowship from those who walk disorderly and not according to the teachings of the Lord, we'll let that just slip by, and we have no hesitancy allowing that to go by the wayside and still think that we're the church of Christ. I told her, I said, I wish you'd just said one other thing, and that would have been, oh, I thought you were a member of the Church of Christ. Now, that would have been a little mean.
You know what I say?
I did, pardon?
I would have invited somebody to come back on the New Testament with her, because you would be dead. God
I remember when I was in Oklahoma City, and with some members of the church, we went by a particular building, and it had named there Church of Christ. And I can't recall what was on the sign at that particular time. It kind of took me back. I didn't understand. I said, does the so-and-so congregation meet there? And said, no. Said, that's their gymnasium. They hadn't built their building yet. They're meeting over in a store, and they built the gymnasium. I said, oh, I thought it was a Church of Christ. Looked kind of startled, you know, and just went on. And I could see that it perplexed them a great deal. I thought it was a Church of Christ. And so then later on, after the shock had ample time to make its inroads, then I went into a little discussion about the church. But Paul condemns them because they were tolerating known public sins in their rank. Now, there are a lot of sins performed by members of the church that would be in different areas, classifications. There might be sins that are not known to the members of the church. We're not to deal with them. Nor are we to be on an investigative witch hunt to see what sins we can dig up on members of the church. But he's talking about known public sins that bring reflection upon the church. There are sins that are committed by all of us through weakness, but we attempt to overcome those sins. We try to do better. We're attempting to live the Christian life. Paul's not talking about that. He's talking about deliberate, willful sinning where an individual persists in it, will not correct it, makes no attempt to correct it, and that's publicly known and bringing reproach upon church. That cannot be tolerated. You must withdraw fellowship. I really wish that our members here could sit in one respect, one area only, but I wish the members here could sit in the meetings with the elders for about 2 months. They meet every Sunday afternoon, all Sunday afternoon, and Carrie and I meet with them at their invitation, generally, and sometimes they exclude us. We don't appreciate that too much. No, I'm joking about that. But occasionally they exclude us from the meeting, but generally they invite us to be in the meeting. We're there every Sunday afternoon with them. They meet quite often Wednesday night after services, much to the berating of their wives, and I can't blame them for that. And sometimes they'll, and I don't mean that as a reflection upon the wives. I feel sorry for those poor wives. You know, they stand around here twiddling their thumbs quite often while the elders are meeting, and it makes it bad for them on occasion. Well, generally, yes and no, depending on what you mean by it. But I really wish that members of the church could sit in and see the deliberations that go on in the eldership in regard to wayward, negligent, disobedient members. A visit, if possible, not only a visit, visit after visit after visit is made by the elders as well as other members to wayward members. Now, a lot of times the elders can't get with them. They won't see them. They'll call up and try to make an appointment. They'll never be able to get an appointment to see them. If they go by the house, a lot of times the door isn't open, or if it is open, it's cracked open, and they're not invited to come in or anything else. Our members ought to know some of the things that the elders have to contend with in trying to oversee the affairs of the church here. They just don't have any idea what goes on. And then, they withdraw fellowship or talk about withdrawing fellowship from somebody, and then here a group of members will come up and say, I think those people ought to be contacted and worked with rather than withdrawn from. Well, get in there and do some of it, why don't you? Because they've been doing it for months, generally. And a lot of times when they can't get with that person, and after time after time after time of trying to get with that person and can't get there, then they send them a letter. And they have no response from the letter. And then they'll write another letter, and on and on and on. Anyway, doing everything humanly possible to try to contact that individual, bring them back to the Lord, and a lot of times they're able to meet with the individual. Now, if the individual, and this is one thing I think the membership needs to understand, if the individual is just weak, wayward, negligent, disobedient through weakness, and you'll find some individuals, for example, that have been wayward and negligent for over a year. The elders have done absolutely nothing about withdrawing fellowship from that individual. And you'll find some individuals been wayward and negligent maybe for 2 months, and the elders withdraw fellowship from that individual. And I know it's been questioned. Well, here's so-and-so 2 years, and here's so-and-so for 2 months. Why? The attitude. One is weak. One says, I want to do what's right, and I'll try to be there Sunday, and they're not there Sunday. And they go back and see them. Well, I was sick, her daughter was sick. I know I should have been there, but I couldn't be there, and on and on and on. The person's just weak. Just weak. Has a good heart, wants to do what's right, but just weak. It comes to a time that you're going to have to do something about that individual. But another individual has this attitude: I don't care what the Bible says, and I don't care what you think about it, and it's none of your business what I do. That individual is rebellious against God and against the authority that God has vested in the elders and the authority of the church itself. And they don't spend any time with that individual. Incorrigibly rebellious.
Have those certain individuals that are incorrigibly rebellious, are they ever, or were they ever very faithful?
Oh, yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And they changed an attitude that far away?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. A lot of things that enter into this. One really plan on getting into a discussion of this at this time, but it does come in tolerating known public sins in their rank. If an individual has committed adultery or fornication, we're ready to withdraw from that individual the next morning. But an individual that has been an affront to Jesus Christ in not attending the services of worship and honoring God as He's commanded to do upon the first day of every week, they'll just think nothing about that. It's all right, and let it go. And yet you've got the same scriptures condemning the one as condemning the other in the area of withdrawal fellowship. But yes, some of them have been very faithful. Members don't like this because there are exceptions to it. But you can watch. I do. You can watch an individual. They'll be sitting up here in the first third of the congregation, the assembly of the congregation. First third. Then they get back to a half. Then they get back to the last 2/3. Then they get back toward the last. That doesn't necessarily mean, and that's where we have trouble, because Immediately somebody rushes on. You mean to tell me that you said because I'm sitting in the back? No, no. But it indicates something. You know that the individual wants to be a part and get into the work of the church. Generally, not always, generally sits toward the front. They want to get into it. Every psychiatrist, every sociologist, every psychologist throughout the land tells you that an individual sits toward the back in services of worship because they don't want to be a part. They want to be separate and apart to that of which they are a part. They're trying to stay out of it. And they get closer, they get involved, they want to be a part of it. There are exceptions to that. We've got two wonderful ladies here. Now, I hope you won't, if you do express anything there, we'll express it in the right name. The Cantrills. They sit on the back row all the time. There's no couple more involved in the work of this congregation than they. They sit on the back row. I don't know exactly how. They're quiet. They're to themselves. And I'm not saying that in any...
I don't get any quiet sitting in the back.
Well, I'm speaking about their nature. Their nature is not an outgoing, it's not a gregarious nature. All of us are different. They sit on the back row. It's not meant as a reflection to them. But you can watch it. I've watched it time and time. I know when a person's getting into problems. Huh? I guess. I couldn't sit in the back. I might as well stay at home, frankly. There's too much distraction. I can't worship, frankly. But maybe someone else can. I'm not trying to judge the other. But I do know. I see it. I see this person moving from here, back to here, back to here, back to here, and I know what's happening. I know generally what's happening. Now, if they're always back there, and a lot of women are back there because of their babies.
I'm going to say I've been here 10 years, and I've always loved to sit up front. I've had to sit in the back for the last few months where I can get out.
Yeah.
And
that
I've met the courting couples, and I've met the new babies that I wouldn't have met otherwise.
Well, that's true too. There are reasons on occasions for people sitting in the back. Personalities, babies, getting to a sick husband, or whatever. And that's why you have to be very hesitant by expressing yourself. But I can watch a person moving from the front to the back, and I know what's happening to that individual. Their love for Christ is growing cold, almost invariably, when you see a movement toward the back. Now, some will sit in the back all the time, but a movement toward the back, they get a little further all the time. They're getting less involved in the congregation and its activities. Then they start missing Wednesday night. Then they start missing Sunday night. They start missing Sunday morning Bible study. And it's a progressive step coming to what? Yes, some of them have been very faithful. And once you miss, you know, it pangs your conscience. But once you miss, it's easier to miss next time. And the next time, and the next time, and the next time, until pretty soon it becomes a habit, a way of life. And it becomes acceptable. And you've got individuals in this congregation who at one time were very faithful, caught up in the work of the church, who through just negligence have become wayward and actually lukewarm, nauseating to the Lord.
The times that I've seen that, though, Bill, is mostly with when Ron and I were at Gold Coast, and the negligence or, you know, being, I don't remember many that were rebellious, one or two maybe families that we knew of, okay? Usually I saw that from weakness over a petty little thing, okay, and then that would make them stay home Wednesday night because they were too tired, and if they didn't want to bother, then it got to Sunday evening and Sunday night, whatever, Sunday morning. But it was usually because of weakness, all right, over something petty.
Yes, that's true. Listen, but when, after it does begin that way, as a general rule, some calamity in the family, something that brings about a weakness on their part through situations in life. But then it develops into generally a rebellious spirit. After it goes, that's the course that it naturally takes. Then they become rebellious. And they hate and have no hesitancy expressing their hatred for those who try to alter the situation in love for their soul. And, just speaking frankly, I speak a little more frank to this class than I do any other class. That's always been true. But in quitting the pulpit work, though I will miss certain things, of course, I still have a lot of pulpit work. But I tell you, it's going to be such a relief in so many ways. Invariably, I'm the scapegoat. Not always. We've got an eldership here that's a little unique in that I think they're really elders, and they become the scapegoats too. But every time somebody gets weak, becomes negligent, before too long, I'm the reason for it. Invariably. My sermons are too long, my sermons don't have any meat in them, or my sermons are too deep, or my sermons are this, or my sermons are that. And I hear it all the time. It comes up practically every Sunday afternoon in the elders meeting. This one has this against Bill Hatcher. This one has, and it's the weak people who are, I become the scapegoat. That's human nature. It's because of me that they are as they are. And I've gone to some of them and said, why, listen, I'm not worth it. Don't take out on the Lord because of me. I'm not worth it. Go somewhere else, be faithful to the Lord. But they aren't going somewhere else to be faithful to the Lord because they don't want to be faithful to the Lord. I'm the scapegoat. And I tell you, I'm not going to miss that at all. Not at all. And I'm not going to miss people coming out and giving me their little barbs and pricks on, sermon to be what is it? A sermon to be well, in other words, for a sermon to be good, it doesn't have to be so long that it's eternal. Immortal, it doesn't have to be eternal, something like that. Anyway, but those things that go on all the time, they wear thin after 11 and a half years. Now, I have very little of that in this congregation, I'll admit. This most unusual congregation, unique congregation I've ever been associated with. But you have enough that it keeps you humble over the years, even though some might question whether or not I'm humble. I thought you were raising your hand. Sorry. Well, that's far from tolerating known public sins in their rank. Going to law against their brethren before the courts of the unbeliever. If we could ever get members of the church stop talking about their brethren before unbelievers and defaming the church before unbelievers, and that's the principle that's involved here, we'd have it made. We wonder why a husband, we wonder why a wife, we wonder why our children, we wonder why our parents, we wonder why our friends aren't interested in the church. I'll tell you why. In most cases, because the only thing they've heard about the church, other than our trying to win them to the church, are derogatory remarks. What's wrong with the church? And it's paraded before the court of the unbeliever, just as Paul was condemning it here. Him? Were you?
Going back to the thing, I'm not supposed to drive at night anymore. I've had this for several months. So I can't stand it because if it's look out and the weather's halfway through, it's not getting the time. But it's where we live. I'm real ugly. I said after 30 years, I don't think you have to ask me.
Well, a lot of that, Em, is showing an interest. You know, I'll come up to people, and it's resented a lot of times, and I have to be very cautious about it, but I'll come up to people and say, did I miss you Sunday night? And it's a sincere interest in them, and they resent it. They think that I'm patrolling them or policing them. Yet if I don't show the interest, well, you didn't miss me Sunday night, and I wasn't here. So, you know, you can't win for losing. But generally, that's an interest, and people don't know how to express that interest other than sometimes in a very curt way.
Now, I like Sunday school. Sunday school has always been my favorite. Certainly exists with all stuff, really. Sunday school would be my favorite. And I'm trying to get so many that don't come, you know,
Yes.
Then we have to miss 2 or 3 times in a row.
Well, you get more Bible out of the Sunday school, as we call it, than you will in the worship period as a general rule. Immorality, inconsideration of the brethren, and desecration in worship. You talk about a congregation that had problems, Corinth did, and yet they're called saints of Christ. Some of the questions entertained by Paul in the epistle pertain to marriage relationships, things offered unto idol, and spiritual gifts, all which have their modern counterpart. Now, evidently, Paul had received a letter from this congregation before he wrote this. For example, the 7th chapter and verse 1. He says, Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, you wrote unto me in regard to these things, and I'm now giving answer to some of the questions that you've asked. He also received information concerning them from the house of Chloe. The 1st chapter in verse 11. It says, For it has been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. Paul did a boo-boo. You don't ever tell your source. You know, and that just gripes me sometimes. I talk about my gripes, and everybody has a right to talk about their gripes, but I tell you, that can gripe me quicker than anything. Well, you know, someone said thus and so about you, or about this or that one or this. Who? Well, now, I don't want to do an injustice by them. Oh, you're going to do an injustice by me and by the truth, or you're going to do an injustice by these others and by the truth. And frankly, it's not worthy of consideration. A person not willing to give their source and ready to stand behind it, it's not worthy of consideration. It's like these anonymous letters that you receive, you know. The only thing that they're fit for is filing in the trash can. Now, the letters that are signed, then they're worthy of consideration. You may not agree with it, but they're worthy of respect and consideration. And Paul was willing to give, and I've always wondered how the house of Chloe felt about this. We've got to go back to associate with those brethren. So he had received information from the house of Chloe. He'd also received a letter, evidently, from the church at Corinth. Some, incidentally, speculate in the 16th chapter and verse 17, they speculate that Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus were of the household of Chloe. Paul mentions them specifically. I'm glad of the coming of Stephanas, Fortunatus, Achaicus, for that which was lacking on your part they have supplied. Well, many have concluded, speculated, this is the household of Chloe from whom he had received this information concerning the church there. And it could well be. Now, a question that disturbs us in regard to the 1 Corinthian letter, had Paul written another letter to this same congregation before this one? And that discussion enters from the 5th chapter and verse 9. I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators. Well, is there a 1 Corinthian epistle that we've lost? And this should be the 2 Corinthian epistle, and the 3 Corinthian epistle would be the 2 Corinthian epistle as we have it listed. What is this letter that Paul had written unto them, this epistle that he had written unto them not to company with fornicators? All right, you've got a number of answers. Some say that epistle is 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, and verse 14 through the 7th chapter and verse 1. Well, if so, that's the shortest epistle, I guess, that's been written. There is a break. Let me go back to the, 10th verse. As sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, as poor, yet making many rich, as having nothing, yet possessing all things. O ye Corinthians, our mouth is open unto you, our heart is enlarged. Ye are not straitened in us, but ye are straitened in your own bowels. Now for recompense in the same I speak as unto my children. Be ye also enlarged. Now verse 2 of the 7th chapter, receive us. We've wronged no man, we've corrupted no man, we've defrauded no man. There is a natural sequence of discussion from the 13th verse of the 6th chapter to the 7th chapter in verse 2. And verses 14 through 18 of the 6th chapter and the first verse of the 7th chapter is an entirely different discussion. Now, the question is this the first epistle? In the passage, he doesn't say especially that not to company with fornicators, but he does talk about having concord with the unbeliever and idol worshipers and so forth. Then there are others who say, well, that 1 Corinthian epistle is actually 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter through the 13th chapter. But the 10th chapter through the 13th chapter is the 1 Corinthian epistle, and the 1 Corinthian epistle is the 2 Corinthian epistle, and chapters 1 through 9 of 2 Corinthians is the 3 Corinthian epistle. Well, the 10th chapter through the 13th chapter, let's just take one thing into consideration in regard to that. The 13th chapter in verse 1. He says, this is the 3rd time I'm coming unto you. This is the 3rd time I'm coming unto you. He came unto them, first of all, in the preaching of the gospel, their establishment of the church, came to him 2nd time in the 1 Corinthian letter, came to him 3rd time in the 2 Corinthian letter. Now, the answer to that that's given by others is, no, this isn't referring to the 3rd time specifically coming to them, beginning with his preaching the gospel to them in the city of Corinth, but rather the 3rd time in an epistle. Well, if that be true, then it certainly wouldn't be the former letter to the 1 Corinthian letter, would it? Did I lose you? I'm seeing some...
Yeah. What is that 13th verse 2? He goes on, I told you before, and I foretell you, as if I were present the 2nd time, and being absent now. All right, then we here to us then, and all those, if I can get all of them.
All right, he was with them present the 1st time in the establishment of the church there. And he's telling them now as if he were present the 2nd time with them. Which would lend credence to the idea that this 3rd time coming unto them included the first trip to Corinth, when he bodily was present with them. I lost you? Okay, let me go through. He says, all right, I told you before, foretell you, as if I were present. As if I were present. He's not. He's come to him only by the epistle. As if I were present the 2nd time. All right, as if I were present the 2nd time. He's not present the 2nd time.
Okay.
When was he present the 1st time?
When he
Established church there. And so that would seemingly give credence to the idea, this is the 3rd time that I'm coming to you, or give support to the idea, this is the 3rd time that I'm coming to you, that the 1st time was his appearance to them in the city of Corinth, 2nd time was 1 Corinthian letter, 3rd time was 2 Corinthian letter. All right, others have said that 2 Corinthians, the 1st chapter through the 9th chapter, is the 1 Corinthian letter. The 1 Corinthian letter is the 2 Corinthian letter. And the 10th chapter through the 13th chapter, the 2 Corinthian letter is the 3 Corinthian letter. Well, all right, that may be true, but let's look at 2 Corinthians, the 2nd chapter, and verses 1 through 4. But I determined this with myself, that I would not come again to you in heaviness. For if I make you sorry, who is he then that maketh me glad, but the same which is made sorry by me? And I wrote this same thing unto you, lest when I came I should have sorrow from them of whom I ought to rejoice. All right, he'd already written before this time. This can't be the first epistle. I'd written to you before, he said. I wrote the same thing to you. lest when I came I should have sorrow from them from whom I ought to rejoice, having confidence in you all, that my joy is the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote unto you with many tears, not that ye should be grieved, but that ye might know the love which I have more abundantly unto you. Now, without reading all the rest of it, what's he saying? This man that I talked about that you ought to withdraw from, he said, now that he's repented, receive him back into your midst. That can't have reference to anything except 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. So, this idea, 2 Corinthians 1 through 9, certainly can't stand as being the 1 Corinthian letter. And I don't believe, in light of 13th chapter, verse 1, that 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 will stand as the 1 Corinthian letter. What about 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through the 7th chapter, verse 1? Well, as far as I've been able to determine in all my studies, and that doesn't mean too much, there's no basis for taking that out of the 2 Corinthian letter and making it a 1 Corinthian letter. It wouldn't have any introduction. It wouldn't have any salutation. It doesn't even read like an epistle. And I find no basis in secular history or in the epistles themselves that would warrant taking this small passage, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 1, 6 verses, and making it a 1 Corinthian epistle. So I personally would discredit that. Well, then how are we going to accept, or in light of what understanding will we accept the 5th chapter of the 1 Corinthian letter in verse 9? I wrote unto you in an epistle not to company with fornicators. Notice he didn't say an epistle to you. He said, I wrote unto you in an epistle. I wrote unto you in an epistle. An epistle seemingly does not specify, just an epistle, generic, not to company with fornicators. Let's look in connection with that a principle that's set forth in Paul's writing in the Colossian letter, the 4th chapter, and verse 16. And when this epistle is read among you, cause that it be read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that ye likewise read the epistle from Laodicea. Now Paul is setting up a procedure that we historically know to be correct. When the epistle was received by a particular congregation, they made copies of it, and then it was distributed among other congregations, and they also read it. Notice again that principle in 1 Thessalonians, the 5th chapter, and verse 27. I charge you by the Lord that this epistle be read unto all the holy brethren. So the epistle that was given to the church at Thessalonica was to be read to all the holy brethren. Now in these epistles, not specifically to the Corinthians, Paul warns against fornication, not to company with fornicators. Why could he not have reference to such as that, which was a common practice among the early church, and which was also commanded by Paul in at least 2 of his epistles? I wrote unto you in an epistle, not an epistle addressed to you, but in an epistle not to company with fornicators. Any thoughts or questions about that? All right, we've got 2.5 minutes, and I guess I'll let you out early.